Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Let's see the topic about fracture. Fracture. First, definition of fracture. Fracture is a break or interruption. Fracture is a break or interruption in the continuity of the bone. Interruption in the continuity of the bone. Continuity of the bone, which is caused by which is caused by mechanical exposure, trauma, or pathology, tumor or inflammation, First, fracture. Definition of fracture. Fracture is a break or interruption in the continuity of a bone which is caused by mechanical exposure, trauma or pathology, tumor or inflammation. Next, about signs of fracture. The first one is relative sign. Relative signs of fracture. And the second one is absolute sign of fracture. First one, relative signs of fracture. Relative signs of fracture. Local tenderness. The next one is tenderness in waiting along axis. Tenderness in waiting along axis. And the next one is hematoma in the place of fracture. Hematoma in the place of fracture. Next one, change of extremity length. Change of extremity length. The next one is forced position of extremity. Forced position of extremity. These are about the relative signs. Next, about the absolute signs. Absolute signs of fracture. Deformation of extremity. Deformation of extremity. The next one is pathological mobility. Pathological mobility. The next one is bone crepitation. Bone crepitation. Cracking. Cracking. These are the absolute signs of fracture. Next, about types of fracture. The first one is open fracture and the second one is closed fracture. Open fracture and the second one is closed fracture. First one, open fracture. Open fracture. When the bony fragments are exposed to the external environment. Open fracture when the bony fragments are exposed to external environment by means of wound. The next one is closed fracture. The fracture fragments are not exposed outside. Not exposed to outside. But in case of open fracture, the bony fragments are exposed outside. But in case of closed fracture, the fracture fragments are not exposed. Not exposed to outside. Not exposed to outside. These are about the types of fracture. Then next about based on origin of fracture. Based on the origin of fracture. Based on the origin of fracture. First one is congenital. And the next one is acquired. First one about congenital. In congenital or due to changes in the fetal bones or due to changes in the fetal bones or maternal abdominal trauma during pregnancy. During pregnancy. Next about occurred. In occurred, it's traumatic. And the next one is pathological. Pathological caused by tumor. Caused by tumor. Osteomyelitis. Osteomyelitis. Tuberculosis. TB. Tuberculosis. Echinococcus. Echinococcosis. Syphilis. These are the pathological caused by tumor, osteomyelitis, tuberculosis, echinococcosis, syphilis. Then about obstetric. Occur during delivery. Occur during delivery. Passage through the birth canal. Passage through the birth canal. Passage through the birth canal. Next about based on the position of fracture. Based on the position of the fracture. Fracture line. Based on the position of fracture line. That first one is epiphyseal. Epiphyseal. Second one is metaphyseal. And the third one is diaphyseal. Epiphyseal, metaphyseal and diaphyseal. Then next about based on the extent of tissue damage. Based on the extent of tissue damage. Based on the extent of tissue damage. Its first one is here, based on the extent of tissue damage. First one is complicated and the second one is non-complicated. Complicated and non-complicated. In first one, complicated, that is damage of skin, subcutaneous fat. I will write over here, complicated. Complicated, damaging of skin. Damaging of skin. Subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat. Neural trunks. Neural trunks. Visceral organs. Visceral organs. Such as lungs, stomach, brain, etc. These are the complicated, damaging of skin, subcutaneous fat, neural trunks, visceral organs such as lungs, stomach, brain, etc. Then about non-complicated. These are based on the extent of tissue damage. Then next about according to the line of fracture. According to the line of fracture. According to the line of fracture. Here first one is transverse fracture. Transverse fracture. Second one is oblique fracture. Third one is longitudinal fracture. Longitudinal fracture. Fourth one is spiral fracture. Spiral fracture. Fifth one is compression fracture. Compression fracture. Compression fracture. And sixth one is comminuted fracture. Comminuted fracture. And the seventh one is impacted fracture. These are the main common types of fracture: transverse fracture, oblique fracture, longitudinal fracture, spiral fracture, compression fracture, comminuted fracture, impacted fracture. Then about types of fracture. Types of fractures. Complete fracture and incomplete fracture. In first complete fracture, in complete fracture, bone is completely broken into two or more fragments. Bone is completely broken into two or more fragments. For example, transverse fracture. The second one is oblique fracture. Third one is spiral fracture. And the fourth one is impacted fracture. And the fifth one is comminuted fracture. And the sixth one is segmental fracture. And next about incomplete fracture. Second one is incomplete fracture. In incomplete fracture, bone is incompletely divided and periosteum remains in the continuity. In incomplete fracture, bone is incompletely divided and the periosteum remains continuity. Periosteum remains in continuity. periosteum remains cognitive. Example, green stick fracture. Second one, torus fracture. Third one, stress fracture. And the fourth one is compression fracture. Compression fracture. These are the main types of fracture. First one is incomplete fracture and incomplete fracture. Incomplete fracture, the main examples and definition, and incomplete fracture, the main definition and examples. Thank you.